Almost everybody feels like the time that they're in is a time of great anxiety. And of course, our time is no different. We're living in a time where a global trade war makes us all feel like our future is more uncertain than it has been in a long time. There are wars that seem to drag on in Ukraine and Gaza right now that, of course, threaten to pull in other nations, widening the conflict and making them spiral out of control. India and Pakistan earlier this week have started exchanging shots. We have rising polarization that makes developing a consensus on any issue very difficult, so our political leaders are often not able or unwilling to address certain big challenges that we face. We have a generation of children who are experiencing a frightening array of mental health challenges that we didn't face when we were younger. And while we have theories about what might be causing it, we have very little hard data to show what actually is the cause. So we live with uncertainty, and when we do, it's easy for us to doubt God's presence with us. Today I want to look at the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And in their story, we see an extreme example of how God's people must learn to trust in his presence, even when things feel really out of control. So the three friends are among the Jewish exiles who end up being recruited against their will to serve as officials in the Babylonian court. Last week, we looked at how they and their friend Daniel stood against the rules imposed on them by King Nebuchadnezzar and chose not to defile themselves with the food that they ate. In this week's story, we see that the duties that they have as government officials put them in the line of sight of the king, who's trying to create a shared Babylonian identity by creating a unified cult among the conquered peoples of his empires. And this is the context in which we read the story of Daniel chapter 3. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold 60 cubits high and 6 cubits wide, and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. He then summoned the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all the other provincial officials to come to the dedication of the image that he'd set up. So the satraps, prefects, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates, and all of the other provincial officials assembled for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before it. Then the herald loudly proclaimed, "Nations and people of every language, this is what you are commanded to do. As soon as you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, you must fall down and worship the image of gold that the king Nebuchadnezzar has set up. Whoever does not fall down and worship will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace." Therefore, as soon as they heard the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, and all kinds of music, all the nations and peoples of every language fell down and worshipped the image of gold that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. At this time, some astrologers came forward and denounced the Jews. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, "May the king live forever. Your majesty has issued a decree that everyone who hears the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music must fall down and worship the image of gold, and that whoever does not fall down and worship will be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews whom you have set over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who pay no attention to you, your majesty. They neither serve your gods nor worship the image of gold that you've set up." Furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king, and Nebuchadnezzar said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods or worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipe, and all kinds of music, if you're ready to fall down and worship the images I've made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand?" Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to him, "King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, The God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up." Then Nebuchadnezzar was furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his attitude towards them changed. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times hotter than usual, and commanded that some of the strongest soldiers in his army tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. So these men, wearing their robes, trousers, turbans, and other clothes, were bound and thrown into the blazing furnace. The king's command was so urgent and the furnace so hot that the flames of fire killed the soldiers who took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these men, firmly tied, fell into the blazing furnace. Then Nebuchadnezzar leapt to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, "Weren't there 3 men who we threw into the fire?" They replied, "Certainly, your majesty." He said, "Look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods." Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and shouted, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here." So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out of the fire, and the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was the hair on their heads singed. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, "Praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and he had defied the king's command and were willing to give up their lives rather than to serve and worship any god except their own. Therefore I decree that all peoples of nations or languages who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be cut into pieces and their houses turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way." Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So the 3 friends stand against the arrogance of the king in the face of death, trusting that God is able to save them from the king's wrath. The friends know that Nebuchadnezzar has defeated Judah, but they do not believe that he has done so by subduing Israel's God. As the readers of Daniel, we know that God has actually ordained the defeat of Judah in order to punish the people for their unfaithfulness to his covenant. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego believe the Lord is more powerful than King Nebuchadnezzar, his government, his armies, and his gods. So even when Nebuchadnezzar arrogantly says that no God can save them from his hand, they believe in God. They trust that he will never abandon them. Likewise, we too can trust in God, that he will never abandon us. And this should give us courage to stand in faith, trusting God even when we end up in life's trials, our metaphorical fiery furnaces. God is able to deliver us, and God is faithful to deliver us. Although, as we shall see, that deliverance doesn't mean that he spares us from every ordeal. Rather, it means that when all has been said and done, we can trust that God will have been proven faithful to his people. So today I want to look at how God is with us in the fire. There are times when we find ourselves in overwhelming situations. We call out on God to deliver us. I'll call this being saved from the fire. What Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego go through is undoubtedly an ordeal. They're accused by their co-workers maliciously because they resent the fact that these Jews, these foreigners, have been promoted ahead of them. They've been hauled before the king and threatened, and then they're thrown into the fire. And in the ordeal, they must learn to trust God. The NIV actually smooths out some of the translational problems with one verse in particular, verse 17. We can see it when we compare it with another similar translation. So Daniel 3:17 in the NIV, followed by the contemporary English Bible. The NIV says, "If we are thrown into the blazing fire, the God that we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand." But the Common English Bible says, if our God, the one we serve, is able to rescue us from the furnace of flaming fire and from your power, your majesty, then let him rescue us. Now, because there's no punctuation in the original language, it's hard for us to know exactly how to read this verse. It could be expressing certainty in God's existence and his ability and willingness to save them. We know that God can and will save us. Or it could be a hopeful uncertainty. We're pretty sure he can, and we hope that he will. We have to remember that they don't know the end of the story. Like any of us, they're terrified. Faith doesn't mean that we don't experience fear. Faith means that we stand with God and do the right thing in spite of our fears. They choose faithfulness. And when they choose faithfulness, they find themselves among the company of many who've been delivered from difficulty. Sometimes God delivers us from the ordeal that we face. He does this often to demonstrate his power, especially in situations where that power is challenged. Some examples from the scriptures. The children of Israel are, of course, delivered from slavery in Egypt by God striking down the firstborn of the Egyptians, but sparing the Israelites. In Deuteronomy, Moses describes this actually using a furnace as a metaphor. In Deuteronomy 4:20, he says, "But as for you, the Lord took you and brought you out of the iron-smelting furnace, out of Egypt, to be the people of his inheritance as you now are." So we see God's salvation when God uses King Saul to deliver the Israelites from the Philistines, despite the fact that King Saul at this point is an inexperienced king and the Philistines have markedly superior weaponry. We see God's salvation when God chooses to wipe out the Assyrian army that has besieged Jerusalem. This happens after the Assyrian king Sennacherib mocks God, saying, "Why do you think your God is going to be able to save you? The gods of all of these other nations that I've conquered weren't able to save them, so what do you think is going to happen to you?" Of course, the God of Israel was different. God is more powerful than anything that comes against us. And sometimes he shows us this by delivering us from the ordeals that we face. And when God delivers us from the ordeal, he walks with us. We should see how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego walk with God in the fire. Nebuchadnezzar throws 3 men into the fire, but when he observes, he sees 4 men. One, whom he says looks like a son of the gods. Some translations say a god. It's difficult to know exactly how to translate that. So different commentators think about this differently. Some people say, well, it's the angel of the Lord. Now, the angel of the Lord is an Old Testament expression that doesn't necessarily mean like an angel who just happened to come from God. Rather, the angel of the Lord is a designation of a messenger who comes from God who is uniquely identified with God's presence in some way. Some commentators say that this is a pre-incarnation of Jesus. I'm not entirely sure that those two things can't be one and the same thing. Regardless of exactly who is there with them, Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are saved by God's presence in the fire with them. Now, lest we become triumphalist, we need to honestly admit that God doesn't always save his people, at least not always in the way that we would hope. While there are many biblical stories that we love to celebrate about God miraculously saving his people from the ordeals that they face, there are also stories of people who did the right thing and died for their faith. We see, for example, the story of Uriah the Hittite. Uriah was one of David's mighty men. He did nothing wrong, but his wife Bathsheba was a beautiful woman. And when David decided that he had to take her, he had Uriah murdered in order to cover up the affair. What did Uriah do? Nothing. And God did not deliver him. What about Naboth the Jezreelite? A man who refuses to sell his family's vineyard to King Ahab because the sale would run afoul of Jewish inheritance laws. And then when King Ahab's wife, Jezebel, finds out about it, she arranges for him to be falsely accused and executed. He did nothing wrong, and he died for his faith. We can look at the prophets of the Lord, also killed by King Jezebel. Of course, God protects Elijah the prophet, but Elijah talks about the prophets of the Lord who've been put to death by wicked Queen Jezebel on account of their denouncing the wickedness of her and King Ahab. They did the right thing, and they died for their faith. We could look at the faithful Jews who died during the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. During the reign of the Greek king in Syria, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, Judaism was made illegal. He tried to replace it with paganism. And there's a story about a woman with 7 sons who were tortured and murdered because they refused to eat pork in contravention of Jewish dietary laws. Of course, the most striking example of God not delivering someone in the time that we might expect would be Jesus on the cross. Jesus is the only truly righteous man who ever lived, and that makes his death at the hands of sinners that much more shocking. In the garden, Jesus pleads with the Father, "Father, take this cup from me." And yet, in faith, Jesus submits to the will of the Father. "Yet not my will, but yours be done." And when Jesus knows he's about to die on the cross, in Luke's gospel anyways, the last words that he utters are words taken from Psalm 31, a psalm written by David, in which he expresses confidence in God's coming deliverance. "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Is Jesus naive? Still clinging to the idea that God won't actually go through with it and make him die? No, he's already forewarned his disciples that this is exactly where the story is going. Instead, Jesus is expressing his confidence that God will deliver him by raising him from the dead. So, did God deliver Jesus? Well, if by deliver we mean that did God save him on this side of death, then the answer is clearly no. But if we widen our view, we see that God delivered Jesus through death. He was humiliated on Good Friday, but he was raised triumphantly on Easter Sunday. And while it is true that Jesus' death is unique in what it accomplishes, his calling to give his life in obedience to the Father is not unique. After all, Jesus calls his disciples to deny themselves, take up their cross, and follow him. When we look at the story of the apostles who wrote the New Testament, we can see the lives of people who trusted God. And yet, almost to a man, they were killed for their faith. Now, these weren't naive men who were mistaken, believing that God would deliver them from death. Rather, they understood that the promise of the resurrection means that we need to think differently about God's deliverance. We need to view it with that wider lens. Just as God vindicated Jesus in the resurrection, so he will vindicate and deliver us from death. So when we face hard challenges in this life, we can trust that God is able to deliver us from them. And he may deliver us from them here and now in the time that we would like. Or God may choose to allow us to go through the fiery furnace, and he will deliver us even if it is on the other side of death. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were delivered from the fire through God's presence with them. But all those who God saves through the fire are saved by God's presence with them as well. Even when we suffer, Jesus is there with us. First, Jesus identifies with our suffering, our hardship, and our weakness. Jesus experienced poverty, political oppression, religious persecution, racial prejudice, dislocation. He was a refugee in Egypt. False accusation, and about the most terrible death that humans can devise. When we say that God knows what we're going through, we don't mean in some abstract sense. God knows exactly what we go through because he's been there himself. He's experienced it. Second, Jesus lives in and through us. As Paul says, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So God is not detached from our suffering. He experiences it in solidarity with us. So whether God saves us from the fire or whether God saves us through the fire, he is with us. He cares for us. He promises that he will deliver and vindicate us even if he has to walk through the fires of death to do so. So if you ever face death on account of your faith, know that no matter how grave your troubles, God is with you. Now, to be honest, in our culture, we probably don't expect that standing for our faith will cost us our lives. What a blessing that comes from God. But it does remind us that we should keep our brothers and sisters around the world in prayer because they may face such choices. Yet standing faithfully for God means that we will experience hardships and difficulties. God may deliver us from them, or he may sustain us by his presence as we go through them. Faithfulness to God often comes with a cost. Maybe you refuse to go along with the shady practices at work. Maybe it's something your coworkers do and they don't like you very much because you stand for what's right. Maybe it's something the boss is doing and you lose your job on account of not being willing to play along. Maybe the Holy Spirit convicts you of some past thing that you've done wrong, something that you could get away with, and yet God asks you to own up to it, knowing that it's going to hurt and it's going to cost you to do so. The choices that we make to be faithful to God can make our lives more difficult in the short term. Jesus can relate to our situation. He always did what was right, and he often paid a price for it. So when we find ourselves in life's fiery furnaces, we can pray for confidence. Maybe God will deliver us out of that situation, vindicating us here and now. Maybe God will walk with us in the furnace. Maybe deliverance doesn't happen right now. Instead, it might only ever come on the other side of death. But in either case, we know that God is always with us and that our salvation is assured because he is with us in the fire.